I'm Scott Belsky. I'm here at Luminance 2012. I run Behance, a platform for creatives around the world to showcase and discover creative work. When I think about the future of any creative industry, I'm thinking these days more and more about the individual. Whereas before we used to think about the agency or the roster at this or the group of people that always work together here. And now we're starting to really think more about individuals as businesses. In essence, everyone who graduates from any sort of creative program or anyone who embarks in a creative career, you are a business at that point. Well, good afternoon, and thanks for having me. And I've really enjoyed just sitting through the previous presentations here and learning quite a bit. So what I thought I would do is, I've been spending the past 6 or 7 years really obsessed with the intersection of the creative professional world and technology, and thinking a lot about it from the standpoint of productive creative careers and where are creative careers going, and the role of technology in all this. And I am actually not sure of the answer to this question, which does seem obvious to a lot of us at first, right? Is the internet helping or hurting us? And everyone I talk to, when I first ask the question, their answer is usually like, well, it's definitely helping. But then when you kind of go through some of the challenges we're facing and what it's doing, sometimes it's not as certain. And so this is something I'm thinking about all the time, and something that you need to think about, because this is certainly something that will have even a greater and greater impact on our futures as professionals. And so I thought I'd go through this and then share some new things that I've been thinking a lot about that hopefully will be helpful to you, and also talk a little bit about what Behance is doing in the scope of all this stuff. So is the internet helping or hurting? Well, listen, on the plus side, obviously there's some great things. The amplification that the internet provides for us and the exposure that we get seamlessly, is unparalleled. And everyone sort of talked about the eyeballs and the benefit of this. Can't argue with that. Access to free resources. So the friction that used to be there in terms of getting help in certain ways, using tools and utilities for things. The open source community is really the wind at all of our backs right now. There's so much stuff that's being created and put out there for all of us to leverage without paying anything, or paying very little. So that's obviously very exciting as well. And with that is the access to these enterprise solutions that those of us who do billing online, and invoicing clients and Lightrooms and all of this stuff that used to have a studio and a whole staff to do, we can now do on our own. And obviously this is very exciting and empowering for creative careers. The collaboration opportunities. I know there's so many folks on our platform who have connected with other people. A photographer based in Brooklyn connecting with a photo illustrator based in India, and then they decide to do something together, and then that becomes more well-known than either piece alone. That kind of stuff happens all the time, and so that's obviously a great opportunity that the internet opens up for us. So needless to say, this disintermediation piece is also a big part of it. The fact that rather than going through all these different channels, we're starting to be able to really, quote unquote, go direct to consumer and disintermediate a lot of the middle players that used to take a huge toll on all the things that we do. Very exciting things. Internet, great thing for all of us. Well, then we think about the other side of the picture. And so, some of you probably know a lot of designers. Maybe some of you have actually participated in similar things, these spec contests that are out there now. Here's an example of a brand, 55 DSL, owned by Diesel. They needed a new logo. And so they say, hey, great idea. Let's get the world's designers to design logos for us for a 1,300 or 1,500 euro prize. And so they actually had 13,000 submissions. And when we asked people on average how much time they spent, they were like, 2, 3, 4 hours on average. And so you do the math and you realize that over 4 years of 24/7 labor, creative labor, went into a 1,500 euro prize, which is a travesty. And this is happening more and more in your field as well, across all the creative disciplines. And this is something that the internet is making possible. And obviously there's so many flaws with this, starting with the fact that it incentivizes careless engagement. When these sort of things happen and creatives get engaged with these sorts of things, we don't put our best foot forward, but we put stuff out there that is attributed to us, and that can ultimately hurt us in the long term. So that's one thing we're up against. The lack of attribution. The fact that your images show up all over the place, And if your name is with it, you're lucky. If the link back actually goes to the place it's supposed to go, it's even better. And does the image click through to the place that it's supposed to go? Is the proliferation of your content yielding opportunity for you? And more, the answer is no. And this is something that we're up against with the quick proliferation of content and the lack of attribution, the literal loss of attribution in the creative world, which is a big problem. The commoditization. The marketplaces, and the rapid commoditization of creative work is really concerning and interesting to watch how this unfolds. And the fact that, think about it though, the marketplaces, what is the future of marketplaces? We go to marketplaces to find images, to find this, to find that. I think that eventually actually marketplaces won't be a destination any longer, they'll be a given. Anywhere you see any image, you should have the option to buy it, to license it, to anything. If you go to a magazine online or a blog or something and you find a piece of clothing or whatever, I believe that 10 years from now, even maybe sooner than that, the notion of not being able to buy anything in line when you see it will be strange. You'll think the website's broken. So it's interesting to think about how this is all going to play out and how it might impact our careers. Another thing we're up against, right? So where is the disintermediation? We have brands and companies still going through so many middlemen and different channels and different ways to get to the creative, in our case, at the end of the day. And we're not seeing the disintermediation that we would expect. And so that's another thing that the internet frustrates us a little bit about. And so point being, we cannot be passive participants in our own careers and our industry. We can't just sort of be at the mercy of circumstance and the pluses and minuses of the landscape around us. We have to really take a little bit more creative control, if you will. So let's talk a little bit about this. What is the future of creative work looking like, and how can we have this future work for us? And so now I want to just talk about a few ideas. One, which is this notion of distributed creative production. In the future, will more companies and brands work directly with the creatives that create the work? Will they stop going through, all these agencies and middlemen and different marketplaces and stuff like that? Will that be a possible future? How can this be if this is a possible future? And one thing we're always thinking about that would certainly help us get in that direction is this unreasonable notion of creative meritocracy. That somehow, some way, the best ideas and the best work gets matched with the best opportunity. The best talent gets the best opportunity. And so how would creative meritocracy even be possible? And this is something that our team really takes on as a mission. Is how can we make sure that the best talent and the best ideas get the greatest opportunity, and sort of remove middlemen and think about this notion of meritocracy. So let me just give you like a quick overview, it was briefly introduced, but of what Behance is. So this is a platform for creatives of all kinds to showcase their work and really control where it shows up and the attribution that they get, and really take part in a very engaged network of people. In some ways, some people call it like a LinkedIn for the creative world, where you put up your portfolio of all of your projects, and each project can consist of all sorts of multimedia and really tell a story. And when you publish this piece of work, we push it everywhere around the web, including LinkedIn and other places. It's just seamlessly pushed, up to your privacy settings where you want it to go. And as this stuff proliferates, on Behance, we also have started to use the same technology to power other portfolio sites all around the web. So whether it be Adweek or LinkedIn or RISD, SCAD, Pratt, all sorts of platforms and places where they host work. We're now leveraging the technology to allow them to tap into the same way of propagating creative content for creative people. And we're even creating gallery sites that showcase a lot of the best kind of trending or most appreciated stuff that rises to the top in this whole ecosystem of showcasing and discovering creative work. We also are allowing people to have their own personal portfolio sites now tied into this system. So you can seamlessly not only post your work and showcase it on all these places, but also have it integrated and in sync with your own personal sites. And so when we start doing a lot of this and having the community see each other's work in real time, you actually start to be able to tap into the creative stream. So I can say, I want to see every piece of typography out of the country of Romania in the last week that was done for Nike. You can start to search by all these different keywords and copyright settings and all this other information and really see the creative world at work in real time, which is a very exciting thing. And we think, for a few reasons, gets us closer to creative meritocracy. And one of the reasons is because every piece of work that shows on Behance has this little thing at the bottom called an appreciation button. And it's just your way of saying, I love this. Not an original idea, right? This is done on all sorts of websites around the internet. So the interesting thing is that these appreciations add up, right? And you can, of course, sort by the most appreciated this, the most appreciated that, and really get a sense of some metric of quality. Except there is a major flaw with allowing, curation to the masses. Namely, sometimes you end up with something like this on the front page, and it's only for the wrong reasons. So when you turn over curation to the masses, you are left with what the critical mass thinks, for whatever reason at point in time, is interesting and great. And that's a problem. So what we've been thinking about as a team is, well, what is the difference? How do we take the community curation, literally, 14 to 15 million visitors a month, going through all this work, millions and millions of appreciations, and how can we then kind of funnel this? And so we've done two things. One, which is bring on professional curators. Literally, two people's full-time job is to professionally curate the creative world at work and actually tune into what the community thinks, but then add a professional curator lens to it. And then also think about something that we call creative rank, which we've never really talked about before publicly. It's something that we're constantly trying to figure out. And here's how I would articulate this. It is the difference between the critical mass, how many people like something, and the credible mass, which is who likes something. And so if we were to look at photographers' portfolios and the pieces of work that just show up in the most places and get the most appreciations, and professional curators have featured their work in the past, what if we gave those people more weight on the appreciations that they give to other photographers? And if we decided, well, wait, fashion designers also have a really good eye for photography. Let's give them weight on photography work. And then you have, a junior at RISD who puts up a portfolio of photography work, and then someone with a lot of weight appreciates one of those pieces. Can that matter more than if I do it, or if 10,000 other people do it? And so this is the type of thing we're thinking about now. And I think this is how the web can help creative meritocracy take place in the creative world, is thinking about the difference between these two groups of people. If we do this, then I believe that creatives participating on the web, showing their work, spreading it, can almost turn this whole world into a perpetual data-driven talent addition, where your work and you get hired and engaged based on merit. And or even if we can just inch our way closer to this, then we're going in the right direction. Now, in order for this to happen, we have to have better dynamic attribution on the web. This is something that I think a lot about with two hats on. One, leading Behance, and I'm also one of the early advisors and investors in another company called Pinterest. And Pinterest is actually under a lot of attack right now, sometimes from folks who are like, oh, is there attribution? Is this great? Is this not great? And there are a lot of other sites as well, like Tumblr and others, that propagate images like crazy, right? These images show up all over in high frequency. And how do we think about this? And on Behance, whenever a piece of work is published, we're always tracking who else owns it, and making sure that that piece of work is showing up in multiple people's portfolios at once. If someone did the makeup work, if someone did this, if someone did that, having all these people own the project collectively leads, more attribution. Because if you really think about it, any portfolio is really a lie. Because at the end of the day, there are other people that took some part in some aspect of it that aren't being credited properly. And that's important for the web to see. On Pinterest, these images show up everywhere. And one of the things that was really, I think, critical about Pinterest success in the early days was the value for attribution. And if you think about it, when you actually click a pin now on Pinterest, there are literally 5 direct links to the source. There is the link at the top, the image itself clicks through, whereas a lot of sites don't want that, because they don't want to have the bounce, right? They don't want people to leave the site. And here, this is a site that's always trying to sort of drive people to the source. And so I think that more sites need to figure out ways to really value and build in attribution in a very meaningful and dynamic way. And I think that's one step that we get towards creative meritocracy. And the reason is because I've never seen any photographers on Behance complain about their images being on Pinterest because it generates page views and people appreciate their work, and then they show up higher in search and they get more opportunity. And so that ecosystem needs to exist in order for creative careers to thrive online, and in order for you to want your images and your work to show up elsewhere rather than kind of keep it in a walled garden. So it's something to think about in terms of attribution. And so if we get this attribution piece right, and we get the curation right, and the credible mass leads us to creative meritocracy, I would argue that someday soon, discovery will outweigh referral. That someday soon, all of us will be discovered more so through these mechanisms than being referred by someone that has worked with us before or knows us. And I think that will be a really big turning point in the industry. So this exposure can be our greatest source of lead generation and really will help us prepare and act as businesses. A couple more thoughts, which is that there is a new sort of era of professional that is emerging in the creative world. And I think actually now this goes to every company, and whether it's the freelancers or people who work in businesses that start to question how they're supposed to work and what their limitations are and what their hindrances are. And I call this sort of the rise of the free radical. And I think that a lot of us will identify with this, but this is something to think about as we engage also the next generation of workers as assistants or people that we work with, as well as working with clients and others. The notion that we are seeking first and foremost work that is intrinsically rewarding. Right, at this point, there's the general population of creative people on Behance. They tell us that they're less willing now to work in an agency in corporate America in a cube somewhere. Like they're now expecting to have some sort of intrinsic reward from the work that they do. That they want to be able to make stuff often and fail often. It's another one of those expectations, whereas before it was like failure wasn't an option. Now it's like, wait, this is part of the ethos of creative and meaningful work. That we have little tolerance for the friction and the bullshit that gets in the way of putting our best foot forward. And I think that the old boy network tolerance is starting to diminish, and people are starting to say, wait a second, I want to get opportunity based on merit. We expect to be fully utilized and constantly optimized. A lot of people leave jobs now these days, and the HR departments report that they are leaving because they don't feel like they're being put to the test. They don't feel like they're really being utilized. Maybe even less so amongst these folks than a higher salary. They just want to be leveraged fully. We want open source technology to be the wind at our backs. And when we're hired and told to use this inferior piece of whatever because we have to, because of policies or whatever, we're like, screw that. We want to be able to make sure that we leverage what's best, in order to do our greatest work. We think that networking is really sharing. Back in the day where networking is business cards and drinks and whatever else, and now it's like, wait a second, if you create something and you give it to people to use, then they come and give you things to use, and that's networking, that's building your network. And we're seeing a lot of that behavior in Behance with people sharing logos and icons and imagery with each other as a way of building a professional network. And then last but not least, we insist on meritocracy. Like we're just not really willing to be a part of a system that doesn't reward the people with the best work. And so I just think the closing message really here is that we cannot settle. We know what the pluses and the minuses are of the web now. We know how our industry is changing. We know the options before us. And all of us are going to have moments where we have a lot of doubt from doing something differently in our careers. You're going to be in a position where you're going to say, wait, I should change this, or I should change my rates, or I should change the system, or I should work with a different this or that. And I would encourage you to gain confidence from that doubt that you encounter along the way. I feel like society is very hypocritical. We shun people before we celebrate them. The college dropouts, the Jobs, the Zuckerbergs, and the Gates of the world, we shun them for dropping out of college, and oh my goodness, don't do that. And then, of course, we celebrate them for changing life as we know it. And I see that in every field and industry. I was talking to a guy who was on the fast track in a huge publishing house about, I think it was like 6 years or something. 6 years ago, he was on this fast track to a top job, and he decided to take this very unpopular job in a small fledgling group instead called digital publishing within the company. So he sort of defected from the path to the top and took this little fledgling job, and everyone was like, you're crazy. No one's ever going to read a book on a computer. Don't throw away your future. And for whatever reason, the more and more he heard that, the more confident he became. Which goes to say that if everyone thinks you're crazy, you're either crazy or you're really onto something. And so I think all of us will have to make career choices and shifts in the way that we do things. And I encourage you to gain confidence from the doubt you do encounter along the way. And I encourage you to recognize that nothing extraordinary is ever achieved through ordinary means. Nothing extraordinary is ever achieved through ordinary means. Thank you so much for having me today. Oh, questions. That's right. Yes. Okay.
So you started with bringing up that example of the Diesel 55 competition. And I guess my comment is working on speculation, kind of an economic reality when you have a glut of anything? In our case, glut of photographers, glut of designers. And is there ever a case where it's appropriate? Like you're a fledgling designer and you need that break?
Yeah. Well, I get very frustrated when brands push back and say, oh, no, it's our way of engaging the community. And I'm like, you're engaging your community by subjugating your community? Like, that's just not the right way to think about it. I think there's a better way. I think that you're right. Like, when there's excess capacity, there's this desire to engage it. And when people are willing to do work, you want to give them that opportunity. I think there's a better way. I mean, imagine if with this credible mass, this creative rank notion, right? Imagine if we used that to identify 20 photographers that match certain criteria that are like pre-qualified in some way to know that they're good enough. And then you said to all of them, listen, I need this done on spec, but here's the deal. I will actually guarantee you a minimum payment of this, and if I use your work, I'll give you a larger bounty. And so in this sense, you are reducing, you are having people do work for less pay than they'd ordinarily do, but you're using a way of making sure that you're not getting anyone to do work for free. And I think you can tap into some of this data so you don't have 13,000 graphic designers all around the world doing brand identity work and only having one win. So I think there's a way of this evolving. I don't think that crowdsourcing will disappear. And I think there's so many people that are so excited about it. It's like spawned a whole industry. I just think that, like most things, it will need to come back to a sustainable model.
One of my hypotheses, particularly in photography, is that we don't consume enough of our own dog food. It feels like we get kind of stuck looking at our own work or the websites of 2 or 3 people that we like, and there's not a whole lot of discovery. And whereas the design industry seems to be much better about that, and certainly a platform like Behance allows that. Can you talk a little bit more about your feelings on really seeing a much broader array of work?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the vertical sites that exist for the photography community, for the interaction design community, for all these different vertical communities, the tragic outcome of that, if you only limit yourself to that, is you're not exposing yourself to the intersection of different disciplines. And this goes back to like Medici times in Italy, right? That insight comes out of the intersection of different creative disciplines. When an architect is looking at a photographer's work, and a photographer is working at a fashion designer's work, or an illustrator's work, this is where discovery and inspiration and collaboration, quite frankly, comes from. And I think that we can't have that isolation. I mean, that's one thing that Behance is really trying to push. We're always trying to push people to follow people in other verticals. And because that's how we think the creative world evolves, through that sort of exposure. So I think we have to force ourselves and value this. And by the way, it's also a great source of leads, because you may not get a lot of leads from fellow photographers. You just may not. But you will get a ton of leads from designers who need your images. You'll get a ton of leads from photographers or architects who need you to take photographs of the work that they do. So immersing ourselves into a dynamic, diverse, creative community is what we need to be doing.
Scott Belsky.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks.